the lecture on climate change. So this figure shows how much carbon emission is happening starting from 1990s to 2010 in different parts of the world, largely at continental scale. We realize that the within the global carbon emissions, Asia and United States altogether are responsible for over 50% of the global carbon emissions. And although Europe is also responsible for significant emissions of carbon, we also realize that their emissions have stabilized over the last 2 or 3 decades. They do still keep emitting, somewhere about one-fifth of the global emissions, maybe even a little less than one-fifth. But they have stabilized and they are slightly declining, particularly with the European Union. Within the European Union, there's lots of support towards moving towards green energy and lots of policies that strategize to move towards new carbon neutrality. But in Asia, largely that is due to China and India, and then the US altogether. Actually, not only emitting a great proportion of carbon, but their trends are increasing over the time. So, in order to monitor this, so what happens when the global climate changes? So, in other words, what happens when the sea surface temperature starts to rise on average? That results in much significant, dramatic, extreme changes in the global climate patterns in different parts of the world. These changes will go above and beyond the historically known extreme values. So the changes that might result in because of climate change could be prolonged, meaning lasting effects, right? And those effects could be ecological, right? And if it is ecological, like we live in the environment, that becomes a social issue, and then it becomes a political issue, since there should be some policy implications in order to circumvent these problems. So what kind of prolonged changes are we talking about? Well, think about precipitation. Well, what kind of changes are we talking about precipitation? Well, you could actually have droughts in certain parts of the world which are never known to have prolonged droughts. Areas that are known to have droughts may have long prolonged droughts. A drought that only lasted a month may last 2 months now, right? And on the flip side, areas that are relatively drier and arid may experience increased rainfalls, right, for a longer period of time, right? And in certain cases, like dry areas can become even drier, where the biological communities may not be able to adapt to increasing dryness, right? Wetter areas can also become increasingly wetter, right? Um, Again, where the biological communities may not be able to adapt to increased rainfall. You could be experiencing temperature anomalies, again, temperature increments or decreases going above and beyond historically known extreme values, right? So when temperature changes, right, of course it leads to changes in rainfall, it leads to changes in hydrologic regimes, it could result in changes in humidity, right? In other words, when the climate becomes hotter, right, your immediate surrounding atmosphere becomes more humid, right? Temperature changes results in differences or changes in wind patterns, wind directions, wind strengths. Um, and of course, we also know about this phenomena, looking at this image, right? Increasing temperatures, right, will result in declining global sea ice cover, right? And global sea ice is actually, a different form of habitats, which are mostly occupied by um, polar bears, and polar bears are not the only organisms. There are other Arctic wildlife and Antarctic wildlife. Penguins, seals, walrus, Arctic foxes, that actually inhabit, extensive sea ice. For example, to point out something that you might already know, many Arctic wildlife, these particularly sea lions, they depend on presence of sea ice for hunting. They hunt on sea ice, right? And then polar bears forage on sea ice. So declining sea ice is actually going to, lead into loss of habitats for these creatures. And like I mentioned earlier, right? You could be experiencing increasing precipitation on one part of the world and extreme droughts in the other part of the world, right? So climate change, in other words, indicate massive fluctuations in the climate regimes, exceeding extremities that has been historically known. So now let's look at global scale anomalies or abnormalities in precipitation. Um, Looking at the diagram, we are looking at data collected up to September 2010, right? So the circles indicates departure from the average precipitation from 1961 to 1990, and um, the reference, so that's the reference point. Reference point is the average precipitation from 1961 to 1990, and that average that reference point is compared to um, temperature anomalies at global scale in September 2010, right? So the brown circles indicates loss of precipitation compared to the reference point. Green circles indicate increased precipitation compared to the reference point. Larger the circle, the greater the change. So let's look at some of those points and see where you see browns and where you see greens, right? So if you look at the western US first, right, as well as Alaska, right, those areas, Alaska, for example, are known to get, great volumes of precipitation through snowfall. But we do notice that in certain coastal parts of Alaska who have experienced in September 2010 significant dryness compared to the historical records. If you look at the Western North America, right, this shouldn't surprise you. We know by 2010 they actually had a massive drought, right? And interestingly enough, that this dry, arid desert climates of northern Mexico experienced increased precipitation in September 2010. Right? You look at these areas around the Amazon basin, right, experienced increasing dryness during that time frame. Right? And if you come over here in Australia, which is generally tends to have drier climate, in September, experience higher precipitation. Northwestern part of India, that usually do not receive much precipitation. That's dry, arid, semi-arid, desert-like climates. Experience increases in precipitation. Right? So you can see very similar patterns all over the map, and you can follow those dots on yourself and kind of try to get a understanding about what's going on. So the point is, in different parts of the world, we are experiencing unprecedented patterns of variation in precipitation. So just to show you some more evidence, right? In this map, the U.S. Drought Monitor, I'm taking it from 2013. They're looking at a heat map, right? So darker red colorations indicates areas experiencing exceptionally dry drought conditions, yellower conditions, relatively less extreme dry conditions. So if you look at it, um, you can clearly see parts of western United States, particularly the arid southwest. You see several points experiencing extremely high levels of droughts. And in terms of California and Nevada, this shouldn't be surprising because we know within the last few years, within the last half decade, or even for the last decade, these areas suffered wildfire, which actually is attributable to increasing dryness of the vegetation, which can easily catch fire. And also, interestingly, parts of the northern Mississippi River Basin has um, some dry spots, which usually, receive plenty of rainfall, but now they're actually experiencing dryness, including certain parts south of the Great Lakes area. Um, and if you look at the eastern part of the US, you don't see much dryness. One exception could be the Long Island part of New York have experienced some dryness. Eastern part of Massachusetts, unsurprisingly, have experienced dryness within the last decade as well as this decade, right? And if you come to the southeast, you still see some relatively abnormally dry areas around some major river basins, even in the southeast. So global climate change within the when you're looking at how that impacts us, you do see within the last decade or even within the current decade, a lot of evidence regarding increased incidences of natural disasters and extreme and prolonged climate events, right? So if we were at 2014 summer map, for example. I picked 2014 because that's among 2014, 2015, 2016. That kind of shows a remarkable time frame with abnormal seasonal weather events. Right, the western part of the country was locked in a drought or a prolonged drought. Right, and then you look at the sort of the south central part of the country, part of the Great Basin. Were not getting their monsoons as expected, right? But immediately north of that area, you actually are looking at areas with experiencing flash floods. That has never experienced flash floods, right? And then if you move to sort of the more to the southeast, right? You look at it around Texas, you are looking at evidence for worsening droughts, right? And then moving further towards the Gulf of Mexico, right? You're looking at states that are gradually, increasing their summer temperatures, right? And then, of course, I do recall, like in the Midwestern area, those areas went beyond being generalized, right? Where certain spots actually have very extremely variable weather patterns, right? And then New England experiencing temperature swings. Now you might say, oh yeah, New England, that's typical New England used to have temperature swings. But I'm talking about not typical temperature swings. I'm talking about temperature swings happening within a shorter time frame, happening where the temperature swings are happening towards. Let me get back to that point. I'm talking about temperature swings happening beyond what is normal. I'm talking about temperature swings so dramatic, the swings are happening within a shorter period of time, and that swings are happening over and over and over, right? So that kind of patterns are not normal even for New England, right? And then of course these severe thunderstorms, that actually occurs from the Great Plains states all the way to the eastern coast, where the intensities of these storms have actually increased um, significantly even within that particular year. So if you look at the same winter, right, winter during the same year, um, now you experience increasingly colder temperatures in certain parts of the south arid southwest, right? And again, severe winter storms, right, in the Appalachian areas, right? And then above average snowfall in the Great Lakes states, right? And then repeated cold snaps in northern parts of the. The other impacts of climate change include decreasing in snow and ice coverage at global scale, particularly in mountains, including particularly specifically in the mountains of the northern hemisphere, um, Swiss alpines, for example, and that's not just limited to the northern hemisphere. Even if you look at some of the um, snow caps in mountains of the tropical areas, like in the eastern African mountains, have already lost a significant proportion of their snow cover. And with increasing temperatures, you have increasing sea levels, right? That's what happens when ice sheets melt, when glaciers melt, when land snow cover melts. It actually adds more water um, into the flow, into the overland flow, and ultimately ending up in the ocean. So the ocean levels start to rise. And up to today, about nearly about 50% of the Arctic Circle's ice cover has declined. Um, as you can see in this particular figure, in this particular graph, right? And then those images show how much actually the Arctic ice cover has declined from 1982 to 2007. It's approximately about 50% decline, and then what is projected is also a lot more dramatic, right? So some of these projections show that by turn of the 2100s, right, we could lose as much as 75% of the snow cover in the Arctic Circle. So in this image, you are looking at the Arctic Circle, and in 19 this image shows the snow cover of the Arctic Circle in 1984, and you kind of see how much wide this particular snow this snow slash ice sheet is. It actually extends from northern Canada and northern Alaska all the way towards towards Greenland and even past Greenland. So it kind of creates a bridge, an ice bridge between um, the continental North America and Greenland. And then, of course, if you look at the east-west axis, it connects all of those Canadian islands and Greenland with parts of Russia. So this kind of extensive um, ice sheets are extremely important hunting grounds for many mammals, which includes predominantly polar bears, who hunts on these ice-covered sheets for seals, right? And and then also for many other Arctic wildlife, like Arctic foxes, depend on this snow cover, right? And this kind of a greater snow cover helps these large carnivores to move back and forth, right, between these large continents. It kind of creates a land bridge over the ocean, so that the wildlife can navigate from Asia, from Russia towards northern Africa. And that kind of movements are extremely important for Arctic wildlife because they don't have a whole lot of land masses or a whole lot of connectivity between existing land masses, right? And now, how much has this declined in 2012? See that nearly 50% decline I was talking about. Now, this not only effectively reduces the hunting grounds available for polar bears and other Arctic wildlife, but it also dissociates the connectivity, right? And dissociated connectivity, meaning reduced gene flow, reduced movement of animals. That actually creates, these isolated subpopulations, that may suffer loss of genetic diversity because there's no gene flow happening effectively, and that leads to many other genetic consequences that may ultimately result in declining in the overall population of these Arctic wildlife. Okay, so questions for you, right? So now I've been telling you that the ice is melting in the poles, and then like, so what, right? No one lives in the North Pole or the South Pole or maybe Santa. But so what is the problem of disappearing sea ice? Does it happen humans at all? Yeah, I get it that Arctic wildlife are going to get fucked up, but what else? What are the other problems that I am going to encounter because of this problem? Hmm. Oh, why should we care? Well, the answer is, right? Well, what happens to that water that is melting from these ice sheets, from these glaciers, right? That's a huge amount of water added into the ocean, right? And in fact, if you look at Greenland itself, there's a lots of huge proportion of the Greenland is snow covered, ice covered. All of that um, melting ice, will end up in the ocean, right? And that will ultimately result in increasing sea levels. Okay, and not only it is not just the melting ice that contribute towards rising sea level, right? With increasing sea surface temperature, what happens is the sea water also expands, right? That also contributes to rising sea level. So who's at bay here will actually coastal areas, smaller islands that does not increase much from the surface, from the ground, from the sea level, are actually could actually be completely inundated, right? Coastal ecosystem can get completely inundated, damaged, right? And any human property, right? Buildings, houses, businesses can get inundated. To name a few states, Texas, Louisiana, South Carolina coastal North Carolina. I mean, between South Carolina and North Carolina, um, they actually have a huge extent of coastal wetlands called Carolina Bays that can completely get inundated with increasing sea levels. Right, Florida, a large proportion of the southern Florida, parts of the Florida Panhandle can get inundated. And then, well, okay, that's not the only problem, right? If the sea level is rising, seawater can actually intrude landwards. That could happen along waterways, right? Certain um, coastal rivers can suffer seawater intrusions, right? I'm not talking about simple tidal water flow, right? Certain coastal rivers actually can sustain some level of tidal influx. I am talking about a permanent inundation of coastal water bodies, permanent loss of deltas, freshwater deltas, permanent loss of coastal freshwater habitats, increased salinity of coastal brackish water wetlands. Well, not only that, some of the groundwater can also get infiltrated in this way, right? And that groundwater can get then contaminated with salt water and become increased in salinity. And that kind of groundwater cannot be used for human consumption or even for irrigation, right? And that will effectively lead to loss of consumable water, right? That will impact agriculture, right? That kind of water cannot be used for industries, right? It will, if you do, it will result in corrosion of machinery. And in the US, there are a few coastal paddy fields, paddy farms, that could get completely destroyed because of this rising sea levels. I'm talking about particularly paddy fields that are currently active in parts of the south central part of the United States. And some of the coastal areas of India, particularly to the southern India, the deltas of Bangladesh, right, are already experiencing um, seawater intrusion, right? Parts of Sri Lankan coastline could be actually inundated. Certain coastal islands, not coastal islands, certain Pacific islands like Thailand could lose some of their effective land acreage because of this problem. Some islands like Maldives in the Indian Ocean can completely disappear. Florida Keys could disappear, right? Maybe not completely, but to a certain degree, could actually disappear because of rising seawater levels, right? And some of the island nations can completely disappear, like Marshall Islands, which is actually some kind of a U.S. territory, could cease to exist if seawater rise um, continue in the current trend.